Welcome to the Reading for Wellbeing podcast. I'm your host, Professor Pozzulo. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Mark Medley, author of Live to See the Day, Impossible Goals, Unimaginable Futures, and the Pursuit of Things That May Never Be. Thank you so much for being here, Mark. Wonderful to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Before we start talking about your book, maybe tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got started writing.
Of course, yeah. I am currently the deputy opinion editor at the Globe and Mail. I've been at the Globe for about a dozen years, and I currently oversee the weekend opinion section. So that is a section that comes out every weekend. It's a mix of our columnists, freelance, long form essays, short form essays about any topic under the sun. Prior to that, I was the books editor here at the Globe. And prior to joining the Globe, I spent about 8 years at the National Post, where I was a reporter, mostly in the arts and culture section, and I was a books editor there as well. So I've been writing and editing and covering books for much of my career, and now I have finally written one. As far as how I became a writer, I've wanted to be a writer since I was, 7 years old. Writing a book was kind of my own impossible goal. After university, I realized quite quickly the best way to pay the rent as a writer was to become a journalist. So I went to what was then Ryerson for journalism school, and ever since then, I have made my living with words.
Amazing. Well, I love your words. Your book is fantastic, really inspirational. What a journey you take the reader on. So to provide a little bit of context for people who haven't read your book yet, my quick synopsis is, you interview a number of individuals who are pursuing goals that may not be achieved in their lifetime, but they keep going, they persevere. And even with the knowledge that they may not achieve their goals, they still have this passion and they still work toward them. And it made me think about, you and writing this book. I think you started it in 2019, just before the pandemic.
I did, yeah.
And then the pandemic hit, and you kept going. And so what motivated you to write this book, to finish this book?
I never intended to become a character in this book. I don't like writing about myself at all. One of the reasons I became a journalist is because I'm curious about other people and their lives and telling their stories. And in early drafts of this book, or, I'm thinking back to my book proposal, I didn't want the word I to appear because it wasn't about me. I was trying to put my lens on these people who, in my estimation, have lived really remarkable, peculiar lives. And as you said, about 6 months, less than that, after I started the book, the world shut down. And, here in Canada, it was very difficult to travel. We kind of forget about how difficult it was. And, we've put it out of our minds. But for about 2 years, I felt like really couldn't go anywhere safely because, most of the people I interviewed were outside Canada. And so I despaired. I didn't think this book was ever going to see the light of day, there's this great irony that I'd finally gotten a book contract, this thing I'd waited at this point 32 years for, because I was in my late 30s when I started. And I could see the finish line, and yet it didn't look like I was going to be able to cross that finish line. And yet, I went down into my basement, not this basement office, we've moved since, and continued to work on the book every day, whether it was talking to people around the world on Zoom or doing some research or writing a sentence or a paragraph or two. And it struck me quite, soon into the process that I was doing what these people were doing, because even though I had no clue back in 2020, 2021, whether this book was ever going to see the light of day, I had no idea when the pandemic was going to end. I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to travel or put this together or see it through to completion. I did it anyway. And that is what the people in this book do as well. They live their lives in pursuit of this thing they're passionate about that they are very, very aware is never going to come to fruition. I was lucky enough that I have lived to see the day this book is out, which is quite remarkable. I still pinch myself. Whereas the people I introduce readers to in this book, none of them. They're still, they're still in their kind of pandemics. They're still looking at the finish line. And most of them started the race knowing they were never going to cross the finish line, which to me is, that was the question that set me off on this journey in the first place. Why somebody would spend a lifetime in pursuit of something they knew was never going to happen.
Did you get an answer to your question?
I mean, yes and no, right? Obviously, I continued to write my book because I love to write. And the work was very meaningful to me. It was very interesting to me. It was a way to take my mind off what was going on in the world. Obviously, the majority of the people in this book, they started for vastly different reasons and they face vastly different obstacles than I do. But I think the one commonality we share is they find great meaning and they find joy in what they do, even though, they know what they are hoping for is never going to come to pass. To them, this is such a cliche, but, this was said to me so many times. It is about the journey, not the destination. These are people who, for them, the run is more important than, the end. And so that is, that's the great commonality. I mean, I don't think I needed to write a book to learn that, but it was interesting to have that, underscored many, many times during the years I worked on this.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about whether you had sort of a favorite story in the book. I really connected with Bonnie Morton, who,
That's interesting.
whose mission was to end poverty. And I think she's still working at it, even though, she retired and she came out of
Yeah,
retirement.
she'll never be able to retire. Yeah.
Never. It's her life. I mean, it's her passion. It's her life. So I just wonder for you, was there one that connected more for you, and maybe why?
I think for me, the story that I go back to time and time again is Jeremy Holden, who is a British photographer who has been based in Southeast Asia since the early 1990s. He currently lives in Cambodia, but for most of this time, he was on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. And he is this brilliant guy who has been trying to get a creature called the orang pendek on film. Now, the orang pendek is basically Indonesia's version of Bigfoot. The indigenous people who call the island home tell stories of it. Marco Polo referred to it in his journals. The settlers during the era of the Dutch East Indies Company reported seeing it. And Jeremy was, a young man, early 20s, and he's backpacking around Asia, as people tend to do. And he met a journalist named Debbie Martyr, who was a Brit as well. And she had been in Indonesia for a couple of years, not full time, but kind of going back and forth between London and Sumatra. And after spending a couple weeks together, he told her, I'm looking for this creature named the orang pendek. She was a journalist. She was curious about the story. And Jeremy decided that he was going to help her on her quest. And they both claimed to have seen the creature. Conveniently, there was no camera at the time, especially when Jeremy saw it. And so he basically vowed to himself, he has had this very much life-changing experience where he is very familiar with animals and the wild, and, he knows what he saw isn't in any animal biology textbook. And so he kind of vows to himself, I'm going to get this on film. And he has spent, the last 40 odd years doing this. He has not done this. And he's pretty aware that he's never going to do this. And, he has done this to detriment of relationships, financial security. The way he put it to me is, he has forsaken any degree of a normal life to do this. And yet he still does. And, I think it was partly the story, it's like an adventure story, this weird ape that, only a handful of people have seen. I went to Sumatra and we spent a week in the rainforest. And so, that was a very life-changing experience for me. So I think those things add up to it being the one that I think I'm going to remember, 50 years from now. But the thing about him as well is, he is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. I believe him that he did see something, whether it was an orang pendek or not, I'm not going to say. But as far as the people who kind of embody, I think, the spirit of the book, and this kind of perseverance and this patience and this will to filter out everything else in the pursuit of this impossible goal, I think he's the one who kind of comes closest to that original idea I had. He's almost the purest example of what I was hoping to achieve with this book.
Were you, I suspect you were surprised, often, researching and connecting with these various people. What surprised, what was your biggest surprise, maybe?
I mean, I think the biggest surprise was how many people fit the mold, right? Because when I started this book, I mean, this is the prologue. I'd written a profile at the National Post about this politician, Liz White, who is the head of a very small political party, and she runs for office every election, and she knows she's never going to get sent to Ottawa, and yet she does it anyway. And that remains one of my favorite things I've ever written. But I followed her career in the years that pass, and it's not like she gave up. Every election, she would put her name on the ballot, and she would get 80 votes, 100 votes, 150 votes. That might be the record. It's not like the party was getting more and more popular. If anything, it might have been getting less popular. And, after following her for a while, I was like, okay, there's something really, really admirable about that. There's something very interesting about that. And so for me, I wanted to go out into the world and find more people like Liz White. And I didn't know what I was going to find. And going back to your question, once I started looking, I started finding examples of this everywhere. You don't have to move to Sumatra and look for a mystery ape to fit the criteria. I think everybody, to one degree or another in their lives, have a goal that they probably, in their heart of hearts know they're never going to achieve. And yet they carry the torch anyway. And so it's one of those things where, after working on this book for about a year, I think I sat down with my editor and he was like, how's work going? Have you gotten anywhere? And I was like, I have like 30 or 40 chapters, right? Like, I could have taken this in so many other directions, because once I started, it's like a beautiful mind, and you're looking at the board and the letters start to pop and you start to see everything everywhere. And so that was what surprised me, that this is not as niche a subject as I had feared. I mean, it's kind of quirky, I admit, but I think everybody in their own lives, going back to me, like, I always wanted to write a book and I hadn't done that. And who knows if in another lifetime it might never have happened. Right. And so I think it's one of those things that, everybody can kind of identify something that they pursue that probably won't happen, or, they might, believe it's not going to happen. And so, it's just like, it's like it's not as exceptional as I think I first thought. Right.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think everyone can sort of see themselves in one of the stories that you wrote in one of the chapters. I
didn't expect that. Yeah, I didn't expect that. I mean, I think my fear with this book early on was, people. One of the great ironies of this book is, a lot of the people in this book admitted to me that, they get a lot of, not scorn or mockery, but there's a lot of skepticism as far as what their pursuits are, right? Jeremy says he doesn't really talk about what he does with his friends because they roll their eyes, or they feel bad for him, or they change their subject. And in every chapter, that's the commonality. Scientists and professors who say, their fellow profs would laugh at them for because they were interested in extraterrestrial life or interstellar travel. And when I was writing this book, it was the same kind of thing. Like, I would kind of explain to what I was doing and the people in this book, and I could tell people were like, "Oh, really?" Yeah, for sure. And I still I still kind of feel a little bit of that way. But then you do realize, no, this is a universal experience, right? It doesn't need to be on such a large scale. It doesn't necessarily need to be something that's not going to be accomplished for 1,000 years or 10,000 years, or it will come to pass in 1,000,000 years. It might just be something that, you want to do in the next 6 months, and, you give up after a month because it seems like it's going to take forever, right? Like, I think this desire to to think big and to grasp for things that might seem out of just out of reach is something that is kind of, it's part of the human experience.
Do you have any suggestions for people who maybe want to are feeling kind of discouraged and, they've got to make a decision? Do they keep going or do they just call it a day? Do you have any suggestions?
I mean, I'm the worst person to offer advice because, again, like in most parts of my life, I do give up. I'm somebody who makes a New Year's resolution privately, and then I break it within 48 hours. That happened this year. I'd written a Globe and Mail essay about it that appeared on the cover of my section, being like, this was going to be the year where, I think long term and I do things differently. And, one of my resolutions just crumbled. So as being a procrastinator and somebody who gives up, I am very hesitant to offer advice, but I do think it kind of comes down to, if it's something that you love, if it's something that brings you satisfaction and brings you joy, that you don't start to see as a challenge, but I'm struggling for the right word, but just something that, is that you can make a part of the totality of, your daily existence, like then it doesn't become a chore in the same way. So, yeah, that's not good advice. I just kind of rambled something out, but I mean, that's the best I can offer right now, unfortunately. I'm still figuring it out. That's the thing. Like, I'm still figuring it out. I don't know, this book has kind of forced me, I think, to think about the long term in ways I didn't before. I think about, what my life is going to look like in a decade, what my son's lives are going to look like in 50 years, what maybe if I have grandchildren, what their lives are going to look like in a century, in a way that I never did before, right? Like right now, one of the big, you hear about it all the time, you got to live in the moment. You got to live in the moment. It's great to do that, but the moment ends, right? And it's very important to think about the next moment and the moment after that. And that is what I think this book has done for me more than anything. It has kind of forced me to think about, what happens where, going back to the race analogy, even if I don't cross the finish line, I got the baton, I'm going to hand it to somebody else. And I have to think about that in ways that, I didn't do before.
Yeah. Oh, I love that idea about passing the baton. And I think really that's all we can do in a way is pass that baton.
It's hard for people to do, I think. Everybody wants to cross the finish line. Everybody wants to get the medal. And when you are talking about just being one part of the relay and maybe just being the first leg, right? There's a chapter in this book, going back to things I didn't consider. There's a chapter in this book on planetary defense, which I had no awareness of before starting. And it's basically the field of study, field of research dedicated to protecting the Earth from catastrophic asteroids. And there are only a handful of people in the world who are taking this seriously. It just so happened while I was working on this book, NASA launched its first ever planetary defense mission. So this isn't this isn't some fringe community. This is NASA is putting money behind it. And so I went to the launch out in California when it occurred. And this is the start. This was the first mission, and the technology that is being invented and refined, designed today is going to hopefully come in handy centuries from now, because we have a pretty good idea that, nothing is in space right now on a collision course for Earth. And that's the way they put it to me. It's that, they aren't in it for glory. They aren't in it, to be considered heroes. They are just hoping that what they are doing today benefits not even us, but benefits our descendants sometime down the road, right? So they're starting the relay race, and they're going to hand on the baton, and who knows how many, iterations of that it's going to take before, we're facing down a killer asteroid. And not everybody can do that, right? Like that's a real, I have a lot of respect for people who can do that. It would be like if I started this book knowing I wasn't going to finish and handed it off to somebody else. I don't know if I would have been able to do that, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. That very difficult. So you interviewed a lot of people. I'm betting that there were some interviews and some people that you connected with, and there had to be a decision. Do you include them in the book or not? How did you sort of whittle down who you included, who you profiled? Was there Were there certain things you were looking for, or what was that decision making like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I interviewed about, I think, 260 odd people for this book, and it's only 10 chapters, an intro and a conclusion. So the majority of people I spoke to, just they're thanked in the acknowledgments, but they're not in the book. And they have, I say in the conclusion, there's an entirely different book I could have written that would have been just as maybe more interesting. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think it was partly I wanted to go to Sumatra, and my editor encouraged me. So that was, Jeremy was included. In some cases, people were willing to talk to me once. And then when I said, hey, I'd like to include you in the book, they got cold feet. That only happened a couple of times. Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to write about people who hadn't been written about before. And so there was a few chapters that I think they would have been on the subjects a little better known. And so, being a journalist, you like to break the story. So that factored into it as well. But yeah, no, there was, as far as like people who didn't make the cut, there's a physicist in Connecticut who's devoted his life to time travel in order to invent a machine to go back to save his father's life. One of the best interviews I gave, like brilliant guy, faculty, like, tenured faculty, brilliant guy, couldn't make that work. There was a great chapter. I had a whole thing on exterminators who are trying to get rid of like cockroaches and invasive species. And they just know, like, you're never going to do that. It's like sticking your fingers in the dam. There's always going to be, that didn't get very far on that, but those were very enjoyable. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's a chapter on athletes who are trying to make the big leagues, but, they're never going to get above, A ball or double A. And yet, they're 35 years old and still riding the bus with the 18-year-olds trying to, achieve their dreams from childhood. So you can see it really. I mean, there was a whole chapter. There's going to be a chapter on preppers. People waiting for an apocalypse that probably wouldn't come. And then when the pandemic struck, and I was looking at them with envy because they were ready to go. I was like, well, yeah, can't include them. So yeah, I was all over the place. I went too far. I needed to be reined in earlier, probably, but I would have made the process much quicker than it ended up being.
Are you writing another book? I mean, it sounds like you've got material for another one.
Yeah, I'm gonna say goodbye to this subject. I think I've said everything I can think of on the pursuit of impossible goals. Yeah, I'm under contract for a second book. I have a number of ideas, kind of going back to what I was saying before, somebody who kind of like gives up or procrastinates. I have a list of 100 ideas that I've been, contemplating over the years that I put aside for one reason or another. So I'll go through that and see if any of them speak to me now in ways they didn't before. But, I think I've achieved this one impossible goal, so I think the next one won't feel as impossible.
Well, I'm going to keep my eye open for your next book. Looking forward to it. I have to ask you, what are you reading? What do you read?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I read a lot. I don't read as much as when I was books editor of the Globe or the Post. But yeah, no, I'm constantly, obviously reading newspapers and magazines. As far as what I'm reading right now, I just finished Susan Orlean's memoir, Joyride. She's one of my favorite journalists. I read a lot of fiction. I just finished Michael Crummey's book, The Innocents. I'm making my way through Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove tetralogy. I'm halfway through that. I'm trying to think what else. I'm reading a thriller called King of Ashes by S.A. Cosby right now, which was one of the New York Times best books of last year. My first time reading him. I read all over the place, but I tend to in my downtime, like literary fiction, thrillers, and literary journalism.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to give you the final word on any thoughts on keeping your dream alive and just keep persevering. What would you like our listeners to take away?
Well, I hope they take away a little bit of hope and optimism from this book, which wasn't the plan. When this book was first conceived, I thought it was going to come out in 2022, 2023, and the world would have been a vastly different place if it had landed then. I was kind of annoyed and getting frustrated. It was my fault it's taken this long, but it is coming out, I think, a really interesting time. You look at the headlines and they're really dark and dire, and it's really hard for us to think about the day after tomorrow and like this better future. And I think ultimately this book is about a better future, because I think one of the things that draws these folks together is, even if they don't think about it this way, if you are pursuing an impossible goal, if you are pursuing a goal that you're not going to achieve in your lifetime, and somebody else might, take the baton from you, in the back of your mind, you're admitting there's going to be a world after you're gone, right? And it's hard to think of it that way sometimes. And so, just the very act of doing these things, to me at least, suggests there's going to be another day. And we have to think about that. We have to keep that in mind, that as dark and terrible as the world seems today, hopefully it's going to be better tomorrow. And the folks in this book are doing their part to ensure we get there.
Hmm. Absolutely. And if I could just say, your book was about hope, so hopeful, and you brought some optimism to where I think it could be very dark. We could go dark, but you lift it up, and I think that's so important at this time. So wonderful, such a pleasure talking with you. The book is "Live to See the Day: Impossible Goals, Unimaginable Futures, and the Pursuit of Things That May Never Be" by Mark Medley. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.